Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. My certainty that I'd done exactly as he instructed that night only made it feel longer. I sat in the hallway outside Eliza's room, back against the wall, fighting sleep. Every time my chin dropped to my chest, I jerked awake, heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I heard Eliza talking, her voice alternating between her own and something higher, almost sing-song. I pressed my ear to the door but couldn't make out the words. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. I called her name softly at first, then with increasing urgency. No response. I put my shoulder to the door, once, twice before it gave way. Eliza sat cross-legged in the center of her bed, head tilted at an unnatural angle, smiling at the corner of the ceiling. The salt line across the doorway was broken, scattered. I followed her gaze to the corner, where shadows seemed to pulse and shift. "Eliza," I said, my voice barely audible. She turned to me slowly, her smile too wide, her eyes unfocused. "She says you're a little piggy too, Daddy," she said. But the voice wasn't entirely Eliza's. "Little piggies need to cover their heads before the butcher comes." I crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing Eliza by the shoulders. Her skin was cold, clammy. I shook her, gently at first, then harder, as she continued to smile that horrible, stretched smile. "Eliza, snap out of it." Her head lolled back, then forward. For a moment, her eyes cleared, filled with recognition and fear. "Dad," she whispered in her own voice again. "She's here. She's always here now." I held her close as she began to tremble, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. Over her shoulder, I saw the shadows in the corner deepen, taking on that familiar hunched shape. My throat constricted. My limbs grew heavy. The temperature in the room plummeted. I fought the paralysis with everything I had, focusing on Eliza's weight in my arms, the solidity of her presence. The shadow figure flickered, advancing with that jerky, time-lapse movement. I dragged Eliza toward the door, my movements sluggish, like wading through molasses. The high, thin humming began again. We made it to the hallway. I slammed the door, knowing it wouldn't hold, knowing doors meant nothing to whatever this was. I half-carried Eliza downstairs to the kitchen, as far from her bedroom as we could get. She was more lucid now, but weak, barely able to stand. I sat her at the table and frantically called my father. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:47 a.m. He answered on the first ring, as though he'd been waiting. I didn't waste time with explanations. "It's happening now," I said, my voice shaking. "What do I do?" His voice came clear and strong over the line. He told me to put him on speaker, then to find salt, rosemary from the spice rack, and any iron tool. I did as instructed, placing the phone on the table between Eliza and myself as I searched. The lights in the kitchen flickered. The humming grew louder. Eliza's eyes kept drifting to the doorway, widening with terror at something I couldn't yet see. I found rosemary, a cast iron skillet, and the salt I'd used earlier. My father began to recite something, not in English, not in any language I recognized. The words sounded ancient, guttural. As he spoke, the air in the kitchen grew thick, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The hair on my arms stood on end. The shadow appeared in the doorway, more solid than before. In the harsh overhead light of the kitchen, I could see it clearly for the first time. The blue woman. Her skin wasn't just tinged blue. It was the deep azure of a corpse left too long in water. Her eyes were milky, her lips blackened. That too-wide smile revealed teeth filed to points. She wore the tattered remains of what might have been a nightgown, decades ago. "Cover your head, little piggy," she rasped, her voice like nails on slate. "The butcher is hungry tonight." My father's voice grew louder through the phone. I fumbled with the salt, pouring a circle around Eliza and myself, nearly dropping the container when the blue woman took a stuttering step forward. The lights flickered more violently. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows. My breath clouded before me. Eliza began to keen, a high, frightened sound. The blue woman's form flickered like a television with poor reception. She advanced another step, then another. I raised the iron skillet. I knew it was useless, but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. My father's chanting reached a crescendo. The blue woman stretched out those spider-thin fingers toward us, toward Eliza. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, something changed. The air pressure shifted. The blue woman's form wavered, becoming less substantial. She opened her mouth in what looked like a scream, but no sound came out. My father's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by calm instruction. Sprinkle the rosemary over Eliza's head, then your own. I did so with shaking hands. The blue woman's form grew increasingly transparent, her movements more frantic. She lunged forward, passing through the salt line as though it weren't there. I swung the skillet reflexively. It passed through her, and a cold so intense it burned washed over me. For a moment, I felt her inside me. Ancient, malevolent, hungry. Then it passed. I gasped. The blue woman stood at the edge of our table, her form barely visible now. She was no longer smiling. Her expression held something I never expected to see, fear. Finish it, my father said through the phone. Say the words I taught you as a boy. I hadn't thought of those words in 30 years. The prayer my father had once insisted I memorize, the one I'd rejected along with the rest of his faith. But they came to me now, rising from some deep recess of memory. Words of protection. Words of banishment. I spoke them, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. The blue woman writhed as though in pain. Her mouth opened again in that terrible, silent scream. Her form grew fainter still, until she was nothing more than an outline, a suggestion in the air. With a final, violent twist, she vanished. The lights steadied. The temperature began to rise. Eliza slumped in her chair, unconscious, but breathing steadily. My father was still on the line. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Instead, he explained what I already knew, what I had denied for decades. Our family had been haunted for generations by this entity, this blue woman who fed on grief and fear. She targeted the vulnerable, slipping first into their dreams, then gradually into their waking world. The ritual he'd performed, the one our ancestors passed down, was the only protection. I looked at Eliza's peaceful face, the first time I'd seen her truly at rest in weeks. I thought of my Aunt Marion, who had died without the protection of this ritual. I thought of my own stubborn denial, of anything beyond the measurable, the rational, and how close that denial had come to costing me my daughter. My father arrived the next morning, bringing with him ancient books and family records documenting encounters with the blue woman going back centuries. Together, we performed a more permanent version of the ritual, blessing every room in the house, every doorway and window. Eliza grew stronger by the hour. The shadows beneath her eyes gradually faded. She remembered little of her possession, for which I was grateful, but she remembered the dreams, the whispered threats. Cover your head, little piggy. A warning, my father explained, not a threat. The entity had been compelled by rules older than itself. Covering the head, a ritual protection. The blue woman could not help but reveal her own weakness. I've made peace with my father, and with the truth. Some things exist beyond the reach of science. Some nights, I still wake at 3:17 a.m., my breath fogging in warm air, a pressure on my chest. But I know the words now. I've learned to believe, and when I speak them, the pressure lifts. The cold recedes, and I'm left in the comfortable darkness of an ordinary night, safe from the things that smile from the corners of our perception, waiting for disbelief to create openings. The old have wisdom, the young dismiss as superstition. I am no longer young, and no longer foolish enough to disbelieve. Story 3. The forest doesn't breathe at night. The forest doesn't breathe at night. That's what I noticed first when I moved into the cabin. an unnatural stillness that settles over the woods after sunset, as if the entire woodland holds its breath. Waiting, the daytime chorus of birds and rustling leaves gives way to a silence so complete it feels like pressure on your eardrums. You strain to hear something, anything, to break the void. And when that something finally comes, a twig snapping, or the soft shuffle of movement just beyond your field of vision, you almost wish the silence would return. I came to these woods to escape. The doctors called it acute social withdrawal syndrome. I called it self-preservation. After 32 years of forced smiles and meaningless conversations, something inside me simply broke. The cabin belonged to my uncle, abandoned for years after he disappeared during a hunting trip. My family avoided discussing both him and the property. So when I mentioned wanting it, they practically handed me the deed the same day, relieved to wash their hands of the place. The first 2 weeks passed in blessed isolation. I established a simple routine: gathering firewood in the morning, foraging for mushrooms and berries in the afternoon, and reading by lamplight until sleep took me. No phone, no internet, no human contact. The persistent tightness in my chest began to loosen, like a fist slowly unclenching. I felt myself settling into the forest's rhythm, until the night they appeared. I was returning from the creek with freshly filled water jugs when I noticed movement in the clearing ahead. 3 figures stood at the edge of the treeline, motionless, watching. The evening light caught them at an odd angle, casting elongated shadows that didn't seem connected to their bodies. I froze, water sloshing in the containers. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. They weren't rangers. Their clothes looked handmade, oddly antiquated. Not hikers either, they carried no gear. One raised a hand in greeting. The gesture was stiff, mechanical, as if unfamiliar with the motion. My throat constricted, but I managed a nod. They stepped forward, in perfect sync, moving like a single organism. I noticed something unsettling about their faces, a vague blurriness, as if no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus on their features. My eyes kept sliding off them. The tallest one spoke. Their voice sounded wrong, like air rushing through hollow wood, words flowing together without proper pauses for breath. They asked if I lived alone in the cabin. The question sent a cold trickle down my spine, but isolation had made me desperate for interaction. I didn't immediately retreat. I confirmed that I did, adding that I preferred the solitude. The trio exchanged glances. A silent communication passed between them that made my skin prickle with unease. They introduced themselves as fellow hermits who had been living deeper in the forest for a very long time. No names were offered. I didn't provide mine. They suggested building a meeting place between our territories, a neutral ground where we could occasionally gather. The proposal struck me as bizarre, but I found myself nodding in agreement. There was something compelling about them, a gravitational pull I couldn't resist, despite the alarm bells clanging in my mind. For the next 3 days, we worked on constructing a simple shelter in a small clearing halfway between my cabin and wherever they claimed to live. They brought materials I didn't recognize, twisted branches and fibrous plants I'd never seen, despite my daily hikes through the forest. Their building technique was peculiar. They never used tools, only their hands, which moved with unsettling precision. They worked mostly in silence, communicating through subtle gestures and flickers of expression I couldn't interpret. When they did speak, they asked strange questions about modern life, about cities, electricity, airplanes, with a detached curiosity, like they were studying a foreign culture. They claimed no interest in returning to civilization, yet seemed particularly fascinated by technology. I found myself telling them more than I intended, about my breakdown, my family, my reasons for retreating to the woods. They listened with intense focus, heads tilted at identical angles, never blinking quite often enough. At dusk on the 3rd day, the shelter was complete, a dome structure large enough for 4 people to sit comfortably. The weave was tight, intricate, almost beautiful. It looked impervious to wind or rain. We stood back to admire it as the light faded from the sky. One of them suggested meeting again the following evening, to make it properly ours. Before I could ask what they meant, they turned and melted into the forest, vanishing with uncanny speed. I was left alone with a sudden heaviness in my stomach I couldn't explain. That night I slept poorly. My dreams were full of roots, threading through my body while I lay paralyzed. I woke again and again, convinced I could hear breathing just outside my window. But each time, I found only silence. That oppressive silence. By morning, the forest was shrouded in a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. I delayed my visit to the shelter until mid-afternoon, when the mist finally burned away. What I found stopped me cold. The shelter we had so carefully built just hours before was rotting. The once sturdy branches were blackened, warped, and dripping with a viscous fluid like tar. Fleshy mushrooms had sprouted from every surface, grotesque, bulging growths pulsing with red veins. The structure was breathing, expanding and contracting ever so slightly, as if alive. The air buzzed with flies, unnaturally large, their bodies shimmering with iridescent hues. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Rapid mold? A chemical reaction? But nothing could account for this scale of decomposition in a single night. I circled the shelter, numb with horror. My foot sank into the ground with a sickening squelch. The earth had turned to black mud, though there had been no rain. Then the smell hit me, a stench of rot so overpowering it nearly made me vomit. I stumbled back, pressing my sleeve to my nose, eyes watering. And that's when I saw them, handprints, pressed into the decaying walls from the inside, as if something had been clawing its way out. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches slashing my face. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, but I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door and threw the bolt with shaking hands. As daylight waned, rational thought crept back in. I told myself it had to be a prank, some elaborate trick involving chemicals to speed decay. I would confront them tomorrow. Anger briefly eclipsed fear. But as night fell, the forest silence changed. It became expectant, like an audience waiting for the performance to begin. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I sat rigid in my chair, a kitchen knife clenched in my sweating hand, eyes locked on the door. Around midnight, the scratching began. At first, it was soft, like branches brushing the walls. But it grew more deliberate, slow, methodical, a scrape that moved around the perimeter of the cabin. My breath came in shallow gasps, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the warm lamplight. The scratching stopped, directly outside the window behind me. I didn't turn at first. Couldn't. But slowly, inch by inch, I forced myself to look. A shadow darkened the glass. Too tall. Too thin. Not human. A hand pressed against the pane. Fingers impossibly long, jointed in the wrong places. Though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze. Pressed down on me like weight, rooting me to the chair. A voice drifted through the walls. Hollow, breathless, layered with multiple tones. Out of sync like an echo speaking over itself. We've been alone so long. Let us in. We want to wear you. The lamp flickered. Shadows danced across the cabin walls. When the light stabilized, the window was empty. But the scratching resumed. Now at the door. Instead of the crossed writing implements he'd been vague about, there was now a circle. He hadn't said exactly what had come through, only that he'd stopped attending our sessions shortly after. The counselor said he was doing better, that he'd moved away to start fresh. I needed that fresh start too. I sat back on my heels and examined my work. The circle wasn't perfect, but it would do. My palm stung where I'd sliced it open with my combat knife, the same one I'd carried through 2 tours. The blood had flowed easily, more than I expected. Enough to complete the intricate pattern Torres had drawn for me on a cocktail napkin. For quadrants within the circle, each etched with its own set of symbols I didn't understand. At the center, 2 lines of blood intersected to form a crude cross. Charlie? Charlie, are you there? My voice sounded hollow in the empty apartment. Nothing happened. Rain continued to beat against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed. I cleared my throat and repeated the words. Louder this time. Charlie. Charlie, are you there? The air thickened. The hair on my arms stood on end as the temperature dropped several degrees. I told myself it was just the storm outside, affecting the heating. Nothing supernatural, nothing to fear. But then the blood moved. I blinked, sure I was hallucinating. The intersecting lines at the center of the circle shifted, as if drawn by an invisible finger, the cross rotating slightly clockwise. My breath caught as I watched, transfixed. This wasn't part of Torres's instructions. He'd said I might feel something, a presence perhaps, but he hadn't mentioned this. What are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The blood at the center of the circle bubbled slightly, then settled. No further movement, no response, just the sudden, overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone in my apartment. I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping in my haste. Torres hadn't told me how to end the ritual, how to close whatever door I might have opened. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, planning to call him, to demand answers, but the screen stayed black, dead though I charged it just hours earlier. That first night, nothing else happened. I cleaned up the blood as best I could, though faint stains remained on the wooden floorboards, refusing to come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. I convinced myself it had all been a delusion, a product of stress, too many sleepless nights, the rotating blood, a trick of the light, the sudden cold, a weather-related power fluctuation, the dead phone, a coincidence. I almost believed it, until I woke the next morning to find a set of wet footprints tracking across my bedroom floor. They led from the foot of my bed to the closed bedroom door. Four-toed prints, too large to be human, too distinct to be a spill or a shadow. They glistened in the morning light filtering through my blinds, as if freshly made, though they were dry to the touch when I finally gathered the courage to examine them. They disappeared at the threshold of my bedroom door, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. My heart pounded as I searched every inch of the apartment. Closets, cabinets, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. All empty. The front door was still locked from the inside, the chain still in place. The windows were sealed shut, had been since I moved in. Nothing could have entered. Nothing should have been able to leave. Those footprints. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe I'd sleepwalked, knocked something over. Maybe the pattern only resembled footprints. My mind connecting random shapes into something recognizable. I spent an hour cleaning the floor, erasing all evidence of the prints, then left for my shift at the security firm where I'd worked since my discharge. The day passed without incident. I didn't mention the ritual, or the footprints. Who would believe me? They'd think I was having another episode, like the one that cost me my last job. So I kept my mouth shut, did my rounds, tried to convince myself that coming home would reveal nothing out of the ordinary. I was wrong. The scratches started that night. 3 parallel lines gouged into the wooden frame of my bedroom door, deep enough that splinters protruded from the edges. They hadn't been there when I left that morning. I was sure of it. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough texture, the unmistakable evidence that something with claws had been in my home. My first instinct was to call the police. But what would I tell them? That I'd performed a blood ritual and now some ghost or demon was scratching up my apartment. They'd have me committed. Instead, I did the next best thing. I set up my phone to record the living room while I slept. If something was moving around my apartment at night, I'd catch it on video. The footage the next morning showed nothing. Just my empty living room, undisturbed the entire night. But the new scratches on the inside of my bathroom door told a different story. Same pattern. 3 parallel lines. As if something had tried to claw its way through. And worse, when I stepped out of the shower, I discovered the scratches in the mirror. 3 inflamed red lines running from my right shoulder blade toward the middle of my back. My hands shook as I dabbed antiseptic onto the wounds. They weren't deep, barely breaking the skin, but their presence was undeniable. Something had touched me while I slept. Something had marked me. The realization made my stomach churn. I barely made it to the toilet before retching up what little I'd eaten. I called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day scouring the internet, searching everything I could about the Charlie game, about summoning rituals, about how to reverse them. Most of it was childish nonsense. Slumber party legends, dares, YouTube dramatics. Nothing about blood variations. Nothing about what to do when something actually answered. By evening, my apartment felt like a prison. Every creak in the floorboards, every shifting shadow in the corners took on a sinister character. I couldn't stay another night. I threw some clothes into a duffel bag and drove to a seedy motel on the edge of town. The kind of place rented by the hour. It was run down, but it wasn't my apartment. It didn't have ritual-stained floors or gouged doors or unexplained footprints. It felt safer. I was wrong about that too. In the motel bathroom, the mirror showed me my reflection, and something else. A shadowy figure loomed behind my left shoulder. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun around, finding only empty space. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone, but the sense of being watched clung to me. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back to the headboard, the lights on, a knife clenched in my hand. Every small noise set my nerves alight. Part of me, the part shaped by training, by combat, by hard-learned survival, told me I wasn't imagining it. Something was stalking me, hunting me. The rational part, the part trained to diagnose trauma and isolate delusion, insisted I was cracking. PTSD, isolation, hallucination brought on by stress and guilt. But instinct had kept me alive before. I trusted it now. The next day, I returned to the apartment. I can't explain why. There was a pull, a compulsion, like unfinished business dragging me back. The scratches had multiplied, on the door frames, the coffee table, even etched into the floorboards. And there was a smell now, not strong but undeniable. Beneath the scent of timber and my own cold sweat, blood, that sharp, metallic tang, as if the ritual hadn't ended, as if it was still unfolding just out of view. Then my phone rang. I jumped so violently I nearly dropped it. Torres. I hadn't heard from him in days. My messages had gone unanswered. His voice was strange, distant, echoing like he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. He told me the ritual I'd performed wasn't a game, not meant to call on Charlie or any human spirit. It was far older, a doorway ritual. Not to something dead, but something else. Something that existed between realities, waiting for an invitation. I had given it one, and with my blood, I'd sealed the pact. When I asked him how to send it back, he fell silent. So long I thought the line had gone dead. Then, in a whisper, he told me there was a second ritual. A binding. It wouldn't banish the thing, such entities never truly leave, but it could limit its influence, restrict its reach into our world. That night, I followed his instructions precisely. More blood, more symbols, ones that made my vision blur if I looked at them too long. And when I spoke the words, the response was instant. The air turned ice cold. I could see my breath cloud before me. Shadows in the corners of the room deepened, moved, shifted like oil on water, defying geometry. And then it appeared, or part of it, a limb, stretching from the darkest corner. Not an arm, not quite a tentacle, for long digits curled into cruel talons, reaching toward me. Couldn't breathe. A crushing pressure pinned me, stealing the air from my lungs. My vision dimmed at the edges. I was suffocating. With the last of my strength, I forced out the final words of the ritual. The pressure lifted instantly. The limb withdrew. The shadows receded. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought it was over. But I was wrong again. I felt it then. Presence inside me. A second awareness brushing against my thoughts. It hadn't been banished. Only bound. Bound to me. That was 3 weeks ago. The scratches have stopped. The footprints no longer appear. To an outsider, my apartment would seem untouched, ordinary. No evidence of the ritual, no signs of an intruder. But I know better. Still here. I feel it watching the world through my eyes, riding my senses like a passenger. During the day, I can almost pretend I'm alone. Almost. But at night, when I close my eyes, I see the worlds it wants me to see. Vast alien architectures. Skies where light moves like liquid and darkness presses down like stone. Landscapes shaped by laws that have nothing to do with our reality. And sometimes, in those dreams, I think I see where it's from. And worse, I think it sees me. I catch glimpses of others like me, humans who performed rituals they didn't understand, who now serve as vessels, as windows between worlds. Torres was right about one thing. The nightmares about Afghanistan have stopped. But they've been replaced by something far worse. The knowledge that I'm never alone, will never be alone again. I've become a door that cannot be closed. I've started to notice changes in myself. Small things at first. Food tastes different. Colors seem brighter, or sometimes they shift in my peripheral vision. My reflection doesn't always move in perfect synchronization with me, as if there's a slight delay, or as if something else is adjusting to the mechanics of my body. The binding holds, for now. The entity cannot fully manifest in this world, cannot act independently of me, but I feel it learning, adapting, finding the edges of its confinement, testing, waiting. If you're reading this, if you've heard about some ritual that promises peace or power or answers, walk away. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some games aren't meant to be played. And some things, once invited, never truly leave. I know that now. I live with that truth every waking moment, and in dreams that no longer feel like my own. I wasn't just summoning something from another world. I was offering it a home. In me. Story 5. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the turbulence. It was the cold. A piercing, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate not from outside the aircraft, but from somewhere inside. Perhaps from inside me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of my face, despite the cabin's environmental controls. Nobody else seemed to notice. The businessman beside me continued typing on his laptop. The flight attendant 3 rows ahead still poured coffee with a practiced smile. But I knew something had shifted in the fabric of reality around me. Even before I saw her standing in the aisle. I never knew my auntie in life. She died in 1970, 15 years before I was born, in what the family only ever referred to as the incident. There were no photographs of her displayed in any family home. Her name was seldom mentioned at gatherings, becoming one of those familiar ghosts that haunts not through presence, but through conspicuous absence. All I knew came from snippets of overheard conversations. She had been a flight attendant, they called them stewardesses back then, for Pan American. And she had been buried barefoot, because of some superstition my grandmother held about shoes in the afterlife. Yet I recognized her immediately when she appeared at the front of the cabin during the worst turbulence I'd ever experienced. The Boeing 737 had been cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet, somewhere over Nevada, when the first jolt hit. My stomach lurched as the plane dropped what felt like 100 feet in seconds. The fasten seatbelt signs pinged on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring us that we were merely experiencing some unexpected rough air, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. I'd flown enough to know that pilots always downplayed turbulence. But the tremor in his voice suggested something different this time. The second drop was worse. The overhead bins popped open, spilling bags and coats into the aisle. A chorus of gasps and muffled screams filled the cabin. The plane shuddered like a living thing in pain. My knuckles turned white against the armrests as sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the unnatural cold. That's when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the momentary darkness, something changed. When the emergency lights stuttered on with their sickly yellow glow, the aisle that had been empty moments before was now occupied. She stood facing away from me, her dark blue uniform crisp and perfect, her hair pulled back in an immaculate bun, according to regulations that hadn't been enforced for decades. Even from behind, something about her posture was wrong. Too rigid, too still amidst the violently shaking aircraft. No one else seemed to notice her. The businessman kept typing. The flight attendants remained strapped in their jump seats. The panicking passengers focused on the oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. I blinked hard, convinced she was a hallucination born of fear and altitude. When I opened my eyes, she had turned to face me. Her features were familiar in that strange way family resemblances work. I recognized my own eyes staring back at me, though hers were glazed and vacant. Her lips, blue with cold, moved as though speaking, but no sound reached me over the roar of the struggling engines and the screams of fellow passengers. The most disturbing detail, however, was her bare feet against the airplane carpet. They were pale, almost blue, and somehow looked both solid and insubstantial at once. They left wet impressions on the floor. Not water, but something darker. Something that disappeared seconds after she lifted each foot. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. My mouth went dry, and I found myself unable to swallow. Logic screamed that this couldn't be happening. That the woman standing impossibly. I was still on the plane, still being thrashed by turbulence. When I saw her, it couldn't be Aunt Tilia. She'd been dead for years. But some ancient, primal part of my brain recognized the truth before I could deny it. Whatever looked at me through those familiar eyes wasn't entirely human anymore. She began to walk toward me. Each step was wrong. Too fluid and too jerky at once, like frames of film badly edited together. My breath caught in short, painful gasps. The cold intensified, a glacial weight settling into my chest, until it felt like my lungs were crystallizing from the inside. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was gone, swallowed by fear. The businessman beside me kept typing away, utterly oblivious. She reached our row. He didn't so much as glance up. She leaned over him, face inches from mine. Up close, her skin looked waxy, almost artificial, like a shop mannequin left too long in the sun. Fine cracks had begun to spread from the corners of her eyes and mouth, spiderweb-like fissures in porcelain. Her lips moved, silently, but I understood the words as though they were being whispered directly into my mind. Not your time. Not yet. The plane lurched violently, harder than before, throwing me against the window. Pain burst in my temple and then, darkness. Not unconsciousness, but something deeper. A void. A space where light had never existed. When I came back to myself, we were still in the air. The turbulence had settled into a gentle rocking. Cabin lights flickered back to life. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing we'd navigated around the worst of the storm. Relief spread through the cabin like a gust of warm air. Passengers laughed nervously, gathered scattered belongings, wiped up spilled drinks. Everything appeared normal, except for the cold. It clung to me like a second skin. And the footprints, wet, bare, leading from the front of the plane to my row, slowly vanishing in the recycled air. I didn't move for the rest of the flight. I just sat there, paralyzed, scanning every movement, straining to hear anything that didn't belong. I told myself it was a hallucination. Maybe stress, maybe a concussion from hitting my head. The wet footprints, spilled drinks during turbulence. The cold? Just the aircraft's air system resetting. But I knew better. When we landed in San Francisco 3 hours later, I was the last to leave the plane. I lingered, eyes combing every corner of the cabin. The flight attendants watched me with concern. One asked if I was all right, suggesting turbulence can trigger anxiety, even in seasoned travelers. I mumbled something vague and hurried out, desperate for solid ground and the safety of a crowd. That should have been the end. A strange experience at high altitude. A story to laugh about after a few drinks. But as I lifted my suitcase from the carousel, I felt it again. That same icy bloom between my shoulder blades. I froze. The baggage area was packed. Families reunited. Tourists snapped photos. But through the gaps in the crowd, I saw her, standing motionless. That same dark blue uniform, bare feet. Each time someone passed between us, she was closer, though I never saw her move. My heart pounded like it might burst. Sweat soaked my shirt, despite the cold now enveloping me completely. I let go of my suitcase and ran, pushing past people, ignoring their protests. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping down the humid night air of San Francisco. I found a taxi, took it straight to my hotel, locked the door, shut the curtains, left every light on. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I just needed sleep, that everything would make sense in the morning. Around 5 a.m., fear gave way to exhaustion. I finally fell asleep. The dream came instantly, I was back on the plane. This time it was empty, except for Aunt Tilia. She sat across the aisle watching me. In the dream, she could speak. Her voice sounded like wind moving through cracks in a sealed room. She told me about the crash. The one that killed her. Details my family had never shared. The turbulence. The pilot's mistake. How she'd knew they were going to crash minutes before it happened. How she'd taken off her shoes, because she'd heard that shoes were often the only thing that survived crashes intact. And in that final moment, that irrational act became something sacred. She thought that if her shoes survived while she died, her soul might somehow be trapped in them. I wanted to wake up, desperately, to escape the increasingly distorted version of Aunt Thilia sitting across from me. Her features had begun to shift and melt like wax under heat, subtly at first, then grotesquely, as if reality was no longer bound by the usual laws of physics or sanity. But I remained trapped in the dream, paralyzed, as she explained her purpose. She had been watching over our family for decades, she claimed, intervening when death crept too close, too soon. The turbulence on my flight hadn't been random. A mechanical failure had occurred. A decompression that should have torn the fuselage apart. She had prevented it. Yet such intervention had a price. A life extended must eventually be collected, she told me, her voice dry and crumbling like autumn leaves. Her face was barely recognizable now. Slits where her eyes had been, skin slack and gray like wet paper. Not your time yet, but soon. I'll come for you when it's time. I woke with a strangled scream, drenched in sweat, yet shivering. The hotel room looked ordinary in the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. No footprints on the carpet. No hint of the cold that had wrapped itself around me like burial linen. I stood under the hot shower for a long time, letting the steam try to melt away the residual dread. By checkout, I had almost convinced myself that stress and fatigue had produced the entire episode. A dream, nothing more. 2 weeks passed. I returned home to Chicago, resumed work, slipped back into the monotony of everyday life. The memory of Aunt Thilia began to fade like a photograph left too long in the sun. Some nights, I woke with a chill I couldn't explain. I blamed the building's old heating system. Chicago was infamous for drafty apartments. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My mother. Her voice was tight, brittle, as though stretched over something she didn't quite understand. She asked if I'd come to Thanksgiving dinner this year. Before I could answer, she added something else, something that made my blood run cold. She had been going through my grandmother's effects and found Thilia's old stewardess uniform, perfectly preserved in a garment bag since 1970. She thought I might want it, given my interest in family history. It was complete, she said, except for the shoes. Apparently, my grandmother had been adamant that Thilia be buried barefoot. Said it was an old country tradition. My mother didn't seem troubled by that. She kept talking, her voice distant and casual, unaware of the growing horror settling into me like rot in old wood. She mentioned, offhand, how strange it was that I'd brought up Aunt Thilia recently. Called her, in fact, left a rambling voicemail about the plane crash. 3 weeks ago, the night of my flight, but I had made no such call. As my mother continued speaking, I felt it. That cold again, a familiar bloom of frost threading through my apartment. I turned slowly, drawn to the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. The shadows there looked deeper, thicker, too dark for a late afternoon. I didn't need to look. I already knew. She was there. She was waiting. Not your time yet, she had said, but soon. And I realized, with a kind of helpless clarity, what I should have known from the beginning. Aunt Thilia hadn't saved me from death. She had merely postponed it, marked me, tethered us across a boundary I didn't understand. And somewhere in my apartment, I heard the soft sound of water on tile, wet footprints, one after another, coming closer. Story 6. The whispers began the moment we brought them into our home. Not audible whispers, nothing so obvious or merciful, but a persistent sensation of being watched. A presence that demanded acknowledgement. The 3 pre-icing vessels, each no larger than a coffee mug, sat innocuously on a custom-built glass shelf in our living room. Their earthen surfaces, adorned with faded geometric patterns in rust and black, betrayed nothing of their true nature. But I knew better now. I knew they were waiting, watching, hungering. I never wanted to bring them to Canada. 6 months ago, my career as an investment banker reached its apex with a promotion that relocated us from New York to Toronto. My wife, Elena, an art history professor specializing in pre-Columbian artifacts, was thrilled. Not because of Toronto, but because our move gave her an excuse to spend 2 weeks in Peru. A necessary detour, she called it. Fieldwork for her research. I should have questioned her excitement more thoroughly. Elena had always been passionate about her work, but there was something different this time, an edge to her enthusiasm, an obsession. She had discovered the vessels through an academic contact in Lima, 3 ceremonial objects from a previously undocumented burial site near Cusco. The paperwork looked legitimate, at least to my untrained eye, but I would later learn how easily such documents could be forged. The purchase happened in a dimly lit backroom of an antiquities shop that smelled of incense, dust, and damp earth. The proprietor, an old man with milk-clouded eyes, seemed too eager to part with the vessels, given their supposed historical value. When I questioned the price, which was shockingly low, Elena brushed it off. And so we brought them home, and the whispers followed. She explained that the vessels were from a minor regional culture, of interest primarily to specialized academics like herself rather than major museums. I accepted this explanation despite the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach as the shopkeeper wrapped each vessel in cloth that looked suspiciously like funeral shrouds. Our guide, a local man named Miguel, grew increasingly agitated as we finalized the purchase. While Elena was occupied with payment details, he pulled me aside and spoke in rushed, accented English. He advised against taking the vessels, saying they came from a ceremonial site and were known locally as vasos de sangre, blood cups. When I pressed for more information, he became evasive, mumbling something about the vessels requiring periodic feeding and being best left in their native soil. I dismissed his warnings as superstitious nonsense, likely a scam designed to extract more money from tourists. That night in our hotel, I noticed Elena handling the vessels with unusual reverence, running her fingers along the rim of each in a motion that seemed almost ritualistic. When I mentioned Miguel's warning, she laughed it off, though the sound lacked genuine amusement. She assured me indigenous artifacts often accumulated such legends over time, especially those associated with sacrificial practices. It was simply part of their cultural history, nothing to concern ourselves with. The flight to Toronto was uneventful, though I noticed a peculiar dampness on the cloth surrounding one of the vessels when we unpacked. Elena suggested it was condensation from the pressurized cabin, and I accepted this explanation despite knowing the cargo hold wasn't humid enough for such an effect. Our new home, a spacious Victorian in Rosedale, welcomed the vessels with an almost palpable shift in atmosphere. Elena arranged them prominently in our living room, angled so they caught the morning light through the bay windows. She spent hours photographing them for her upcoming paper, often losing track of time until I found her at 3 a.m., still adjusting lighting and angles with bloodshot eyes. The first incident occurred 3 weeks after our arrival. I woke to find a thin trail of rust-colored water leading from our bedroom to the living room. Following it, I discovered one of the vessels had somehow been moved from its shelf to the floor. The red substance inside, which I initially took for dirty water, had partially spilled onto the hardwood. Elena appeared unusually calm, theorizing that vibrations from a passing truck had dislodged it. She cleaned up the mess herself, refusing my help, and disposed of the rags immediately. I didn't mention that the substance smelled metallic, like copper, like blood. My position at the Toronto office demanded considerable attention, so I initially failed to notice the subtle changes in our household. The power fluctuations that occurred precisely at sunset, the persistent cold spot near the display shelf that defied our top-of-the-line heating system, the dreams that began infiltrating my sleep, dreams of arid mountains, dark chambers carved into bedrock, figures in elaborate headdresses chanting around 3 empty depressions in a stone altar. Elena changed too. She spent increasingly long periods staring at the vessels, often motionless for hours. Her academic work, once her primary passion, fell to secondary importance. When her department chair called, concerned about her extended absence, I realized she hadn't attended faculty meetings for weeks. She began wearing exclusively red clothing, first subtly in accessories, then more overtly in sweaters and dresses. When I commented on her fashion choice, she seemed genuinely surprised, as though unaware of the transformation. Household accidents started about 2 months after our arrival. First, I sliced my palm while chopping vegetables, a deep cut that bled profusely onto the cutting board. Elena, rather than rushing for the first aid kit, calmly collected the blood-soaked board and disappeared momentarily before returning with bandages. Later, I found the board thoroughly cleaned but not in its usual place in the kitchen. Next came Elena's nosebleed, sudden and violent, occurring precisely as she stood before the vessel display. Rather than stepping away to address it, she remained in place, allowing the blood to drip freely for several seconds before responding to my alarmed exclamation. I could have sworn I heard a faint sizzling sound as the drops struck the shelf beneath the artifacts. My own accident in the home office left a paper cut that seemed impossibly deep for such a minor injury. The blood soaked through several important documents, rendering them unusable. When Elena discovered this, she collected the papers with that same unsettling calmness, assuring me she would dispose of them appropriately. I never saw those papers again. Our careers began to suffer. My investment recommendations resulted in substantial losses for key clients. Elena received notification that her research grant application had been rejected due to methodological concerns regarding her acquisition practices. Our savings dwindled as unexpected expenses mounted. A basement flood, a roof leak directly above the vessel display. Peculiarly, the vessels remained untouched by water damage after the automobile repairs following an inexplicable engine failure. Sleep became increasingly elusive. The dreams intensified, now featuring Elena in elaborate pre-Incan regalia presiding over ceremonies I couldn't, or wouldn't, fully recall upon waking. More disturbing were the moments I'd wake to find her side of the bed empty, only to discover her standing motionless before the vessels, whispering in a language I couldn't identify. When confronted the next morning, she had no recollection of these nocturnal activities. During one such episode, I noticed fresh bandages on her index finger. When questioned, she claimed to have cut herself fixing a frame in her study. The frame in question, when I checked later, contained a meticulously rendered drawing of the 3 vessels surrounded by symbols matching those in my dreams. The glass had indeed been recently replaced. It was spotlessly clean except for a small rust-colored fingerprint in one corner. Our social connections withered. Friends stopped calling after Elena behaved erratically at a dinner party, spending the entire evening discussing blood rituals in pre-Columbian cultures, while repeatedly checking her watch as sunset approached. My colleagues maintained strictly professional interactions after I experienced a panic attack during a board meeting, suddenly convinced that everyone present was wearing elaborate animal masks beneath their human faces. For months into our Canadian residence, I contacted Dr. Alejandro Vega, a Peruvian anthropologist who specialized in the region where our vessels originated. Our video consultation began professionally enough, with me showing him photographs of the artifacts. His expression remained neutral until I rotated the largest vessel to display its base, at which point his scholarly composure fractured. He explained, reluctantly at first, that the markings identified these as ritual objects from a small isolated culture that practiced particularly aggressive forms of sacrifice. Unlike their contemporaries who performed such rituals seasonally, this group believed their deities required continuous offerings. The vessels, which he called Coca Diwanui, or reservoirs of death, were designed to collect and preserve sacrificial blood, maintaining a continuous connection between the mortal and divine realms. When I pressed him about our experiences, his academic detachment faltered further. He asked whether we had noticed an escalation of accidents, particularly those resulting in bloodshed. His expression at my affirmative response conveyed nothing so simple as fear, rather a resigned recognition. He explained that vessels removed from their ceremonial context and ancestral lands would seek to replicate their original purpose. They required periodic feeding, blood offerings, and an eventual return to their place of origin. The longer they remained abroad, the more aggressively they would pursue fulfillment of these requirements. I scoffed at these assertions despite the cold dread settling in my chest. When I asked why anyone would create such objects, his response haunted me. They were never meant to leave their temple complex. They had been designed specifically to prevent theft through supernatural deterrence, the ultimate security system for a culture that valued blood as the supreme currency between worlds. Before ending our conversation, Dr. Vega issued a clear warning. Return the vessels to Peru immediately, specifically to a temple foundation near their excavation site, accompanied by an offering. The nature of this offering remained deliberately vague in his explanation, though the implication was clear enough. When I asked about alternatives, his response was simple and chilling. We had already begun paying in blood. The vessels would merely increase their collection efforts until satisfied. I ended the call convinced the man was either perpetuating superstitious nonsense or attempting to acquire valuable artifacts through intimidation. Yet that night, I dreamed more vividly than ever of standing before a stone altar, knife in hand, Elena beside me wearing elaborate ceremonial attire. The three vessels were positioned to catch what would flow from my outstretched arm. I woke to find myself standing in the living room, a kitchen knife in my grip, positioned directly before the vessel display. Elena stood opposite me, her expression vacantly serene, a similar knife in her own hand. The vessels between us seemed to pulse with a dull earth glow. Neither of us spoke as awareness gradually returned. The knives clattered to the floor simultaneously. That morning, without discussion, I booked 2 tickets to Lima. Elena, emerging from whatever fugue had claimed her these past months, helped me carefully rewrap the vessels in their original cloths. As we worked, I noticed fresh scars on her forearms, thin, precise lines that couldn't have resulted from household accidents. She caught my gaze and wordlessly pushed up my own sleeve, revealing similar marks I had no memory of acquiring. In the following days, as we prepared for departure, the household atmosphere shifted palpably. The cold spots dissipated. The power remained stable. Sleep, when it came, was dreamless and deep. Yet occasionally, I would catch Elena staring longingly at the wrapped packages, her fingers tracing absent patterns on her arms. Once, I found her in the kitchen with a knife balanced across her palm, her expression disturbingly contemplative until I spoke her name. The return journey to Peru felt like an extension of our shared trance. We moved through airports and taxis with mechanical efficiency, the wrapped vessels secured in a specialized carrier Elena had arranged. She had hired a local guide, not Miguel, whose number no longer connected, to meet us at a specific location outside Cusco. She assured me the guide understood our purpose without elaboration. Tomorrow, we would make the final journey to return these artifacts to their original location. Elena had packed additional supplies, which she refused to detail. I had already seen the bandages and collection vials in her kit. But I choose not to question these things. Part of me knows, has perhaps always known, what the vessel's final feeding will require. I tell myself we're simply returning stolen artifacts to their rightful place, participating in cultural repatriation rather than something more primitive or supernatural. Yet, as I write this in our Lima hotel room, watching Elena sleep peacefully for the first time in months, I cannot deny the pulse I feel emanating from the wrapped packages across the room. They seem to beat in rhythm with my heart, a synchronization both invasive and strangely intimate. The vessels know they're going home. They know we understand our role as both couriers and final tribute bearers. I should feel relief that our ordeal is nearing its conclusion. Instead, I'm disturbed by a hollow sensation growing inside me. Not quite fear, but a resignation that borders on anticipation. Part of me has begun to understand the ancient impulse that created these vessels, the belief that some connections can only be forged through blood. More disturbing still is the realization taking shape as I watch the vessel's subtle pulsation. I'm not entirely certain we'll actually return them. Elena stirs in her sleep, her fingers tracing geometric patterns against the sheets. The same patterns etched into the vessel surfaces, now faintly visible beneath the skin of my forearms when I stand in certain light. Perhaps we'll board our return flight to Canada empty-handed, telling ourselves we've done the right thing. Perhaps the vessels will remain in their rightful place among the ruins. Or perhaps they've already found their new home. Story 7. The corner of our living room doesn't belong to this world. I've known it since the day my wife and I moved into her family home. A colonial monstrosity with too many rooms and too few windows. Something about the way shadows gather there defies the natural flow of light. My brother and sister visit often, drawn back by the familiarity of their childhood home. But I've seen how they both stare at that corner, heads tilted in unison, responding to questions no one has asked. They call him vovô, grandfather, in Portuguese, a language neither of them speaks. Their grandfather has been missing for 30 years. Not dead, just missing, the family insists. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago when the autumn chill crept into Massachusetts. My sister Emma sat cross-legged before that damned corner, nodding and smiling at empty space. Joel, my brother, stood nearby, hands in pockets, contributing occasional words to this one-sided exchange. When I asked who they were talking to, Emma simply pointed and said, "Vovô is telling us about Portugal." Joel smiled apologetically, explaining they'd always been able to see him there, even as adults. The casualness of their dismissal sent ice through my veins. That night, I watched my wife Maria sleep, her breathing even despite the occasional twitch of her eyelids. Moonlight cast bars across our bed, and I wondered what images played behind her closed eyes. She'd mentioned dreaming of corridors lately. Endless hallways lined with stone, a voice calling her forward. The next morning, her face was gaunt, exhausted. She described walking through an infinite mausoleum-like corridor where she'd encountered her father, the same grandfather my siblings spoke to in our living room corner. According to Maria, he had messages for us all. The house began changing after that. Nothing drastic at first. A light that refused to stay on. The persistent smell of tobacco, though no one smoked. Doors swinging open after being firmly closed. I set up cameras to capture the corner, hoping for an explanation. The footage showed nothing but static and electronic distortion whenever the lens pointed there. When I suggested checking the electrical wiring, Maria looked at me with unfamiliar eyes, accusing me of unnecessary anxiety. My research into the family history revealed little. Maria's grandfather, Antonio Santos, had immigrated from Portugal in the 1950s, built this house with his own hands, and then vanished 3 decades ago during a routine trip to Boston. No body was ever found, no trace of foul play. The family refused to declare him dead. His room on the 3rd floor remained untouched, preserved like a museum exhibit. The first time I entered that room, my lungs constricted as though the air had thickened. Photographs covered every surface. Antonio as a young man in Portugal at his wedding, holding his children, building this very house. My attention fixed on one particular image. Antonio standing in our living room, precisely in front of that corner. His expression was unreadable. Behind him, barely visible in the faded photograph, stood a dark figure. Its features were indistinct but unmistakably present. I began experiencing episodes of missing time. I'd be working in my home office, then suddenly find myself standing before that corner with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My skin would be cold to the touch, my heart hammering as if I'd been running. Sometimes, I'd find notes in my own handwriting, scrawled in Portuguese, a language I'd never studied. The dream started a week later. I found myself walking through endless stone corridors stretching in every direction. The walls were lined with small alcoves, each containing photographs and personal items I recognized from Antonio's room. The air hung heavy with the scent of tobacco and sea salt. A voice echoed through the labyrinth, speaking in Portuguese, words incomprehensible, yet strangely familiar. I would wake gasping for air, my pajamas soaked in sweat, tasting salt on my lips. I began avoiding the living room altogether, making excuses to work late or run errands. When my siblings visited, Maria confronted me, accusing me of distancing myself from her family. I couldn't explain how, every time I entered that room, I felt watched by something ancient and patient. How could I describe the pressure building behind my eyes as I approached that corner, or the whispers I'd started hearing when alone in the house. Yesterday, I snapped. Joel and Emma sat in the living room, lost in their usual one-sided conversation with empty space. I stormed in, demanding to know what game they were playing. The genuine confusion on their faces sent chills down my spine. Emma asked if I was feeling all right, saying Vovo has been worried about your health. Joel added that Vovo had told them about a hidden space beneath the house, a network of tunnels connected to the same corridors Maria dreamed about. My hands trembled as I examined the foundation plans I'd gotten from the town records office. The original blueprints showed nothing unusual, but a revision filed 3 years after construction revealed an addition. A small cellar beneath the northeast corner of the house, the living room corner. The clerk couldn't explain why the revision had been filed separately, or why it bore a strange symbol instead of the official town seal. That night, after Maria fell asleep, I took a crowbar to the floorboards in that corner. The wood came away surprisingly easily, as if recently disturbed. Beneath, instead of the usual joists and insulation, I found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air rising from the opening carried the unmistakable scent of tobacco and sea salt, the same from my dreams. My flashlight revealed stairs carved directly into the earth, spiraling down beyond its beam. The walls were lined with alcoves like those in my dreams, holding photographs, letters, and small personal effects I recognized. Maria's childhood toys, Joel's high school soccer medals, Emma's first glasses. My fingers brushed one alcove and came away wet. Not groundwater, but salt water that stung the paper cuts on my hands. As I descended, the earth walls gradually gave way to worked stone. The rough steps became smooth marble. The temperature dropped steadily until my breath fogged in the air. My flashlight flickered despite fresh batteries, as if the darkness itself was swallowing the light. Hundreds of feet beneath the house, the staircase opened onto a corridor identical to the one from my dreams. The hallway curved gently, disappearing beyond 100 feet in either direction. The walls held alcoves containing items I'd never seen before. Faded photographs of people resembling Maria but unfamiliar, letters in Portuguese dating back centuries. Small carved figurines that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. My heart pounded in the confined space, each beat echoing. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, icy rivulets running down my face and neck. My mouth went dry as I forced myself forward, choosing a direction at random. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness for a moment before sputtering back to life. In that brief blackness, I heard footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, behind me. I spun, shining the beam down the empty corridor. The footsteps continued, now ahead, now behind, now from side passages I hadn't noticed. My breathing grew thunderous in the still underground air, gasping in short, panicked bursts that did little to satisfy my oxygen-starved lungs. My muscles tensed, ready to run, though I had no idea which way to go. The corridor shifted subtly as I moved forward, the ceiling lowering, forcing me to stoop, the walls pressing inward, narrowing my path. The alcoves grew more frequent, more personal. They now contained items from my own life. My college diploma, the tie I wore at my wedding, the manuscript of my unfinished novel locked in my desk drawer, a photograph of myself as a child standing before a house I'd never seen with people I didn't recognize. Ahead, a voice called out in Portuguese, its cadence matching the whispers I'd heard in the house. The words remained incomprehensible but pressed against my mind, seeking entrance. My ears popped as if I'd descended far deeper than possible. The taste of salt grew stronger in my mouth. Around a bend stood a figure, back to me. The shape was unmistakably human, dressed in clothes from another era. A heavy wool coat, high-waisted trousers, a flat cap clutched in one hand. Even without seeing the face, I knew this was 1 hour 37 minutes and 17 seconds. Antonio, his shoulders rose and fell with breath, dispelling any notion that I was seeing a ghost or 1 hour 37 minutes and 24 seconds. Hallucination. My legs locked in place as terror flooded my system. Antonio began. 1 hour 37 minutes and 29 seconds. To turn moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who has all the time in the world. I caught a glimpse of his. 1 hour 37 minutes and 36 seconds. Profile: the same strong nose and jawline that Maria had inherited before my. 1 hour 37 minutes and 41 seconds. Survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran, no longer caring about. 1 hour 37 minutes and 46 seconds. The direction simply needing to be away from that figure who couldn't possibly exist in this underground labyrinth. 1 hour 37 minutes and 53 seconds. The corridor twisted and branched, offering choices. I made blindly, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across. 1 hour and 38 minutes. Stone walls, my lungs burned, my legs ached, but I continued running until I collided. 1 hour 38 minutes and 6 seconds. With a dead end, the stone wall before me was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, overlapping, showing the house from. 1 hour 38 minutes and 13 seconds. Various eras in each image, no matter the decade, the same dark figure stood in the. 1 hour 38 minutes and 19 seconds. Corner of the living room, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes barely visible in the background, but always present. 1 hour 38 minutes and 26 seconds. Always watching. Among these was a photograph I recognized, my wedding day, Maria and I. 1 hour 38 minutes and 33 seconds. Stood before the house surrounded by her family, and there in the window, visible but overlooked until now, was the. 1 hour 38 minutes and 40 seconds. Distinctive silhouette of an elderly man watching the proceedings, the flashlight. 1 hour 38 minutes and 45 seconds. Died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The air became thick almost. 1 hour 38 minutes and 52 seconds. Solid in my lungs. Footsteps approached from behind, unhurried and confident. 1 hour 38 minutes and 58 seconds. Hand cold and dry as parchment came to rest on my shoulder. A voice spoke. 1 hour 39 minutes and 4 seconds. Directly into my ear in accented English. You are part of this family now, you are. 1 hour 39 minutes and 9 seconds. Part of this house, the corridors connect us all. I didn't remember climbing back up the. 1 hour 39 minutes and 15 seconds. Staircase or replacing the floorboards. I awoke this morning in bed beside Maria, my clothes filthy with a. 1 hour 39 minutes and 22 seconds. Mixture of earth and what laboratory tests would later confirm as sea salt from the Atlantic coast of Portugal. 1 hour 39 minutes and 29 seconds. Under my fingernails were stone fragments that geologists would identify as not belonging to any formation in. 1 hour 39 minutes and 35 seconds. North America. Maria smiles at me differently now. She says, I finally. 1 hour 39 minutes and 40 seconds. Understand her family. My siblings visit more often, all three of them sitting before that corner. 1 hour 39 minutes and 47 seconds. Acknowledging the presence, I can now see the silhouette of an elderly man that becomes more solid each day, they tell me. 1 hour 39 minutes and 55 seconds. That Volvo is pleased that I found the corridors, that I'm truly part of the family now. I've begun dreaming of the. 1 hour 40 minutes and 1 second. Corridors myself each night, they become more familiar, less frightening. 1 hour 40 minutes and 7 seconds. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing in that corner, engaged in conversation with Antonio in broken Portuguese. That 1 hour 40 minutes and 14 seconds. Improves with each passing night. He tells me about the house, about the corridors that connect it to Portugal too. 1 hour 40 minutes and 21 seconds. The past to other places entirely. Maria doesn't know that I've discovered her grandfather's journal. 1 hour 40 minutes and 28 seconds. Hidden in a compartment beneath his bed, the entries date back to the 1950s, detailing his discovery of the corridors. 1 hour 40 minutes and 35 seconds. Beneath the original foundation, how he learned to navigate them, how he found they could take him anywhere across. 1 hour 40 minutes and 41 seconds. Oceans across time. The final entry dated the day of. 1 hour 40 minutes and 46 seconds. His disappearance describes his plan to remain in the corridors permanently too. 1 hour 40 minutes and 52 seconds. Become their guardian and keeper. I've started taking Portuguese lessons. I tell Maria it's to better. 1 hour 40 minutes and 58 seconds. Connect with her heritage. The truth is both simpler and more terrifying. I need. 1 hour 41 minutes and 4 seconds. To understand what Antonio is telling me about my role in all this, about what the house expects from me, about why he chose. 1 hour 41 minutes and 11 seconds. Our family to guard the corner that doesn't belong to this world. The corner watches me now, waits for me, and 1 hour 41 minutes and 18 seconds. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the shadows gather just right, I find myself walking toward it, drawn by the 1 hour 41 minutes and 25 seconds. Promise of corridors that lead everywhere and nowhere at once. 1 hour 41 minutes and 33 seconds. Story 8, and the first time I noticed the 1 hour 41 minutes and 40 seconds. Porcelain ballerina had moved. I dismissed it as forgetfulness. The second time I blamed. 1 hour 41 minutes and 47 seconds. The uneven floorboards of my grandmother's Victorian home in Alton. By the third time, when I found it staring at me from the foot of my bed at 3 a.m., its delicate painted face catching moonlight through the curtains. I could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong with this house. My inheritance of grandmother Eleanor's estate had come with strings attached. I was required to live in her home for at least 1 year before deciding its fate. The insurance payout from my apartment fire left me with few options, so I accepted the terms and moved into the creaking, drafty mansion on State Street that had always intimidated me as a child. I'd found excuses to avoid overnight visits for years. Something about the place had always set my nerves on edge. And now, at 36, I was trapped by circumstance, by legal obligation, and by something far more elusive. The porcelain ballerina had been grandmother's prized possession, a handcrafted antique she'd received on her 16th birthday. She'd shown it to me dozens of times during my childhood visits, always handling it with white cotton gloves, always explaining how rare and valuable it was. I never understood her affection for it. Its frozen pirouette and blank blue eyes had always struck me as unsettling rather than beautiful. When I unpacked it after moving in, I placed it inside the glass cabinet in the parlor, hoping to keep it both safe and out of sight. But that night, like the 3 before it, I found myself carrying the ballerina back to the cabinet once more. My fingers trembled as I settled it gently onto the shelf, careful not to disturb its fragile tutu or outstretched arms. Despite the central heating system I'd had installed, my breath clouded the air in front of me. The nearby thermometer read 42 degrees, though the rest of the house held steady at a comfortable 72. The cold spot had appeared the day after I arrived, centered precisely around the cabinet housing grandmother's collection. I shut the glass door, the latch clicking into place. My pulse throbbed in my throat as I tested it again. Locked, just as it should be. I was the only person with a key. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation for the ballerina's movements. But that voice was growing fainter by the day. My friend Marcus, half amused, half concerned, suggested installing cameras after I told him about the haunted ballerina, as he dubbed it. He dropped off a set of motion-activated security cameras the previous weekend, clearly humoring what he thought was an overactive imagination. According to Marcus, old houses groaned and shifted and played tricks on the mind. He speculated that I might be sleepwalking, or perhaps suffering from delayed trauma from the apartment fire. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. For 3 nights, the cameras caught nothing. The ballerina stayed in place. The house remained still. I began to think maybe he was right. Maybe I was coming undone. Then, on the 4th night, every camera in the house failed at precisely 2:17 a.m. When they came back online at 4:03 a.m., the ballerina was perched on the kitchen counter, facing my bedroom door. The footage offered no clues, no shadows, no movement, no entry, just 106 minutes of darkness, and a porcelain figure that had relocated itself across the house. My hands shook as I poured myself a double whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. The pool of rational explanations was quickly drying up, yet I couldn't bring myself to accept the alternative, that something supernatural was occurring in my grandmother's house. A tightness clamped around my chest. My heart raced. Cold sweat beaded across my forehead. I drained the glass, hoping the burn would anchor me, would grant me a few hours of sleep. As October bled into November, sleep grew elusive. I jolted awake at strange hours, certain I'd heard footsteps on the stairs, or worse, a woman humming a melody I didn't recognize. Shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch and shudder just beyond the reach of direct light. The cold spot grew wider. It swallowed the parlor, then bled into neighboring rooms. Desperate, I began researching the house's history. I spent hours buried in the Alton Public Library, poring through property records and old newspaper clippings. The house had been built in 1873 by a river merchant named Hobson, who made his fortune during the steamboat era. After his financial ruin in the 1890s, the property changed hands multiple times before my grandmother purchased it in 1962. There was nothing, no murders, no suicides, no local legends, to explain what I was experiencing. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with wire-rimmed glasses, began to watch me with increasing concern as I returned day after day, my eyes bloodshot, my clothes wrinkled, my demeanor ragged. After a week, she approached me at my table and slid a slip of paper toward me. Her voice was quiet when she said, "If you're experiencing disturbances in an Alton home, you might want to speak with Dr. Mercer at the Historical Society." The way she lingered on the word disturbances made my skin crawl. She didn't meet my eyes as she walked away. Dr. Mercer was a small, energetic man with a neatly trimmed white beard. His face lit up with polite curiosity when I mentioned my grandmother's address, but I watched his expression falter, if only for a moment. He confirmed what I already knew. The house had no grim past, no record of violence, no whispered tales of hauntings. But something in his pause, his slight hesitation, made me press further. Eventually, and with visible reluctance, he told me that while the house itself was clean of tragedy, the land it stood on had once belonged to the Zimmerman family in the early 1800s. At the mention of that name, my pulse quickened. The sound of blood roared in my ears. The Zimmermans had been prominent citizens, he explained, until a scandal involving the eldest daughter led to their departure from Alton society. The family had moved west, leaving no descendants in the area. When I asked the daughter's name, Dr. Mercer consulted his notes and confirmed what I already feared. Candy Zimmerman. My hands grew numb as pins and needles spread through my fingers. The room seemed to tilt slightly, Dr. Mercer's voice becoming distant and muffled. I hadn't told him about the Ouija board. I hadn't told anyone. It had been a foolish decision born of desperation. After 6 weeks of escalating phenomena, I'd purchased the board from a New Age shop in downtown Alton, the proprietor warning me with practiced solemnity about opening doors that couldn't be easily closed. I'd nodded impatiently, dismissing her concerns as superstitious nonsense meant to add mystique to an overpriced piece of cardboard. That night, I'd set up the board on the dining room table, positioning my cameras to record the session. The house had seemed unusually quiet as I placed my fingers on the planchette, the heating system falling silent despite the thermostat being set to 78 degrees. My breath fogged in front of me as I asked if anyone was present. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed, until the planchette began to move with such sudden violence that my fingers could barely maintain contact. It spelled out a name, Siwai. When I'd asked who Candy was, the planchette had dragged my fingers to betrayed and then witness, before flying off the board entirely and clattering against the far wall. The cameras recorded the entire incident, including the planchette's impossible trajectory that defied physics. I deleted the footage the next morning in a moment of panic, suddenly afraid of what might happen if others saw it. Leaving the Historical Society, my mind raced with questions. What did a long-dead woman from the 1800s have to do with my grandmother's porcelain ballerina? What betrayal had occurred, and what had Candy witnessed? The answers began materializing that night. I woke to the sound of breaking glass at 2:17 a.m., the same time the cameras had failed weeks earlier. My body felt leaden, paralyzed with a terror that went beyond normal fear. The temperature in my bedroom had plummeted, my breath forming dense clouds above my face. Through the open doorway I could see the hallway, where moonlight illuminated the porcelain ballerina positioned outside my room. Beside it lay the shattered remains of a small hand mirror I recognized from my grandmother's vanity. In the fragments, I caught glimpses of reflection that didn't match the room around me. Flashes of a different time. Women in long dresses, a garden that no longer existed behind the house. My muscles finally responded to my brain's commands, and I stumbled from the bed, heart hammering painfully against my ribs. I approached the ballerina cautiously, noticing a detail I'd somehow missed before. Painted onto the porcelain face was a tiny beauty mark near the right corner of the mouth, nearly invisible unless viewed in direct light. The realization hit me with such force that I staggered backwards, colliding with the wall behind me. I'd seen that same distinctive beauty mark in one of the old photographs in Dr. Mercer's office, on the face of Candace Zimmerman. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in my car in the driveway, too terrified to remain in the house but too exhausted to drive anywhere. When dawn broke, I forced myself to return inside, drawn to the cabinet where grandmother had kept her collection. With trembling hands, I retrieved the key from my pocket and unlocked it. The ballerina had returned to its shelf, though I hadn't moved it. More troubling, I now noticed the base of the figurine, which I'd always assumed was a solid piece of porcelain. Closer inspection revealed a barely perceptible seam. Using my pocket knife, I carefully pried at the edge until the base separated from the figurine. Hidden inside was a folded scrap of yellowed paper, the handwriting faded but still legible, a confession signed by my grandmother, detailing how she'd discovered evidence of Candy Zimmerman's murder while renovating the house in the 1960s. A crime committed by one of Alton's most respected historical figures. Rather than report it, she'd hidden the evidence to protect the town's reputation and her social standing. The beauty mark on the ballerina had been her private acknowledgement of her silence, her secret penance. The note ended with words that sent ice through my veins. She follows me now. She watches. The witness has become my witness. Understanding flooded through me. The ballerina wasn't haunted. It was a vessel, a connection to a woman whose story had been erased, whose justice had been denied. My grandmother's guilt had given Candy power, and now that connection had transferred to me. I knew what needed to be done. That afternoon, I contacted Dr. Mercer and local authorities, turning over the confession and explaining what I'd found. The scandal rocked Alton, forcing a re-examination of its celebrated history. Excavation began in the area that had once been the Zimmerman garden, now covered by my driveway. I expected the phenomena to cease after the truth was revealed. But in this I was mistaken. The ballerina still moves, though less frequently, and with less malevolence. Sometimes I find it facing photographs of my grandmother. Other times, looking out windows toward the garden where Candy's remains were finally recovered and properly buried. I've chosen to remain in the house beyond my obligated year. There's a strange comfort in our arrangement now, me, the house, and the porcelain witness, who ensures I never forget the cost of silence. Sometimes, at night, I still hear a woman humming from the parlor. The melody is no longer unfamiliar, though the chill never quite leaves certain rooms. Occasionally, the mirrors reflect images that don't belong to this century. But Candy and I have reached an understanding. All she ever wanted was the truth, for someone to acknowledge what had happened to her, to speak her name again in the town that had chosen to forget her. I keep the ballerina on my nightstand now, its blue eyes watching as I drift to sleep. Some might find this arrangement terrifying. Perhaps it is. But there are worse fates than sharing your home with a ghost who only wanted to be remembered. Far worse is the knowledge that my grandmother went to her grave carrying the weight of her silence, haunted by the witness she refused to become. Story 9. The first time my sister mentioned seeing her, I dismissed it as nothing more than the imagination of a woman exhausted from caring for our dying grandmother. The second time, I suggested she get more sleep. By the third time, she had already moved out of the house, refusing to spend another night under that roof. 6 months later, I inherited the property. 6 months and 1 day later, I saw the girl with the blue bows myself. The Victorian house had stood on Blackwood Lane for over a century, weathering storms both meteorological and familial. Its aging wooden bones creaked with each gust of wind, as if sighing under the weight of accumulated memories. When I moved in after my grandmother's passing, I told myself it was practical. Free housing while I sorted out my life after a bitter divorce. The truth, which I barely admitted even to myself, was that I needed to understand what had driven my sister away. Rebecca had always been the rational one between us. As children, she was the one who checked the closets and looked under the bed when I was convinced monsters lurked in the darkness. She became a research scientist, devoted to empirical evidence and logical conclusions. So when she called me at 3 a.m., her voice trembling as she described seeing a young girl with blue hair bows sitting in our grandmother's favorite chair, I knew something was wrong. She just sat there. "Michael," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the static of the phone line. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, watching me. Then she smiled. The second sighting occurred a week later. Rebecca had fallen asleep on the couch while reading research papers. She woke suddenly, the sensation of being watched pulling her from sleep. The girl was lying on the opposite end of the sofa, her small feet nearly touching Rebecca's legs, those blue bows vivid against her pale hair. Rebecca moved out the next day, staying with me until she found her own place 50 miles away. I unpacked my belongings slowly during that first week in the house, each box a quiet commitment to staying despite my sister's warnings. The master bedroom remained untouched. I couldn't bring myself to claim what had been my grandmother's space. Instead, I took the room that had once belonged to Rebecca, its walls still bearing the faded outlines of posters she had hung as a teenager. The house felt larger than I remembered, the hallway stretching longer in the evening shadows. I attributed the goosebumps on my arms to poor insulation, the whispers at the edge of hearing to pipes and settling foundations. Scientific explanations became my mantra as I moved through the empty rooms. I established a routine quickly, hoping structure would combat the unease that crept along my spine whenever I entered certain areas of the house. My grandmother's sitting room remained closed, her favorite chair draped with a sheet like a surrendered ghost. I told myself it was out of respect, not fear. The first incident occurred 11 days after I moved in. I had been in the kitchen preparing dinner, the radio playing softly to combat the silence. The music cut out abruptly, replaced by static that grew progressively louder. My skin prickled as the temperature in the room dropped, my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then came the laughter, high and childlike, yet somehow wrong, as if played at the wrong speed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned toward the doorway. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. I convinced myself it was a power surge affecting the radio, ignoring how the laughter had seemed to come from all around me, not the speakers. 3 days later, I was working at my laptop in the living room when the scent of lilacs filled the air. My grandmother had always worn lilac perfume, its sweet fragrance announcing her presence before she entered a room. I inhaled deeply, memories washing over me. When I opened my eyes, they fell on a small indentation in the sofa cushion beside me, as if someone weightless had just vacated the spot. The fabric was slightly warmer than the surrounding material when I placed my hand on it. My throat constricted, my mouth suddenly bone dry. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I stared at that subtle depression in the fabric. The rational explanations I had clung to began slipping through my fingers like sand. I called Rebecca that night, my voice steadier than I felt, casually asking about her experiences in the house. She hesitated before answering, her words carefully measured. She described how the phenomena had started small, objects relocating when her back was turned, the sensation of someone watching from doorways, the lilac scent appearing in empty rooms. She asked if I had seen the girl yet. When I said no, her relief was palpable through the phone. "Don't look for her," she warned. "Pretend everything is normal." I followed her advice for nearly a week, deliberately averting my gaze from movements at the corner of my vision, ignoring the soft footsteps that sometimes followed me up the stairs. The pressure in the house seemed to increase with each passing day, as if the air itself was becoming denser, harder to move through. Sleep became elusive, my nights punctuated by the sound of something small dragging across the wooden floor above my room. I would lie rigid beneath my blankets, heart threatening to burst from my chest as I strained to track the movement by sound alone. Every night, the noises always stopped directly overhead, followed by a silence so complete it felt heavy in the air. On the seventh night, exhaustion overcame caution. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow steps to the attic, determined to find a raccoon or a squirrel. Anything to explain the sounds that had denied me sleep. The beam of light cut through the dusty air as I swept it across stacked boxes and forgotten furniture. Nothing moved in the confined space. As I turned to leave, the light caught something reflective near the dormer window. A small music box I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I approached it. The box was ornate, its surface adorned with painted flowers and inlaid mother of pearl. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid, and a tiny melody emerged, its notes distorted by age. Inside lay a blue ribbon carefully folded into a bow. The temperature dropped so rapidly that I gasped, and the flashlight slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, hitting the wooden planks with a thud and rolling to a stop with its beam pointing toward the attic entrance. In that narrow corridor of light, I saw them. 2 small feet in antiquated button-up shoes, with the hem of a white dress just visible above. Every muscle in my body seized as a surge of primal terror flooded my system. I couldn't raise my eyes or look any higher. My lungs refused to function, and spots danced at the edges of my vision as oxygen deprivation set in. The feet took one tentative step forward. I broke, scrambling backward on all fours. My elbow struck the music box, sending it clattering across the floor. The melody distorted further, speeding up and slowing down in sickening fluctuations. When my back hit the wall beneath the window, I finally forced my gaze upward. There, in the beam of light, the doorway was empty. My retreat from the attic was undignified. A blind, stumbling escape punctuated by choked whimpers. I ended up sleeping in my car that night, keys in the ignition and ready to flee. Morning brought both shame and a renewed determination to find logical explanations. I researched the history of the house, discovering that the original owners had indeed lost a daughter to illness in 1892. Her name was Elizabeth. I convinced myself that knowledge was power and that if there was a presence in the house, understanding its origin might help me address it. This rationalization allowed me to return inside, though I avoided the attic and kept lights on in every room I occupied. 3 days passed without incident, and I began to relax, attributing my experience to exhaustion and suggestion. Then came the morning when I entered the kitchen to find all the cabinet doors standing open, as if someone had hurriedly searched for something. My hands shook so badly that coffee sloshed over the rim of my mug as I prepared it. The sensation of being watched intensified into an almost physical pressure between my shoulder blades, but I refused to turn around and focused instead on the mundane task before me. When I finally did turn, I caught a glimpse of something white disappearing around the door frame. That night, I called my friend Daniel, inviting him to stay for a few days without explaining why. His presence always seemed to bring a measure of normality to the house. The strange phenomena receded like shadows before sunlight. We spent evenings watching sports and reminiscing about college, a banal shield against what lurked in the corners of my awareness. However, on his 3rd night, I woke to his shouts. I found him in the hallway, his face ashen in the emergency light that illuminated the corridor during an apparent power outage. His words came in disjointed bursts as he described waking to find a young girl sitting at the foot of his bed, her pale hair adorned with blue bows. She had asked him to help her find her mother, but when he reached for his phone to use as a light, she vanished. We spent the remainder of the night in my car again, neither of us willing to return inside until daylight reclaimed the shadows. After breakfast, Daniel left with a haunted expression, promising to call me later. The message he sent contained only a link to a realtor's website listing. It was all he wrote. Alone once more, I felt the house's atmosphere change, as if it sensed my determination to leave. The incidents escalated. Doors slammed with such force that hinges bent. The music box's melody played from empty rooms, and the constant lilac scent now carried an undercurrent of something putrid. I lasted 2 more days before contacting Rebecca. My voice cracked as I asked if I could stay with her while I arranged to sell the house. She agreed immediately, making me promise to leave before nightfall. As I packed a bag, the temperature in my bedroom plummeted. The closet door, which I had deliberately left open since the attic incident, slowly swung closed. My heart nearly stopped as I saw a small hand, with delicate fingers curled around the edge of the door, before it shut completely. Abandoning my belongings, I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time in my desperation to reach the front door. In the foyer, I froze. My grandmother's sitting room door stood open, and in that room, her favorite chair lay with its sheet removed. Sitting there, her small feet barely touched the floor. A girl of perhaps 7 or 8. Her blonde hair was pulled back with blue bows that matched her eyes that were far older than her appearance. The girl looked directly at me without blinking. In that moment of terror, my mind registered absurd details. The outdated style of her white dress, the slight translucence of her form, and the way she seemed to disrupt the air around her like a heat mirage. Then she smiled, revealing, the moment I set foot on the weathered steps of the observation tower at Uncle Wilbur's ranch, the air changed. It became dense, resistant, as if the atmosphere itself objected to my presence. A chill slithered down my spine despite the oppressive August heat that had hounded me all day. The tower stood separate from the main house, a sentinel of splintered wood and rusted metal that had somehow withstood decades of prairie winds. I had no reason to climb it that evening, no logical explanation for why my feet carried me there as the sun bled across the horizon. Some urges defy rationality, and some warnings go unheeded until it's too late. I was 17 that summer, spending my last vacation before college with my eccentric uncle at his isolated Texas ranch. The property sprawled across acres of grassland, punctuated only by the occasional twisted mesquite tree. Uncle Wilbur had inherited the land from his wife's family, a family I knew little about beyond hushed conversations that ceased whenever I entered a room. My parents never explained why we rarely visited, only that Uncle Wilbur preferred his solitude since Aunt Martha passed. That was 15 years ago. The tower had been Aunt Martha's project, Uncle Wilbur had said offhandedly on my first day. He never elaborated, and something in his voice warned against pressing for details. The wooden steps groaned beneath my weight as I ascended, each creak seeming to whisper a warning, growing more urgent the higher I climbed. My hand gripped the splintered railing, the rough wood digging into my palm. By the time I reached the small enclosed platform at the top, my heart had already begun to hammer against my ribs, not from exertion, but from a nameless dread that had no business existing on such an ordinary evening. The observation room was octagonal, with windows on all sides offering panoramic views of the ranch and the dirt road stretching toward the distant highway. The glass was clouded with decades of dust and grime, giving the sunset an otherworldly quality as its light filtered through. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Something sickly sweet that reminded me of the funeral home where we'd said goodbye to my grandmother last winter. I wiped a small circle clean on the western window, intending to watch the sunset. That's when I first noticed them. They sat motionless in the tall grass about 50 yards from the tower, facing the road. A family of 4, arranged as if on an invisible couch. A man, a woman, and 2 figures that might have been teenagers. They were unnaturally still, their forms slightly translucent in the dying light, edges blurred like an overexposed photograph. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks in the strange light, but when I looked again, they remained unmoved. Their clothes seemed old-fashioned, the man in what looked like a suit with a high collar, the woman in a long dress with her hair piled atop her head. The smaller figures were less distinct, but their postures suggested a posed formality that felt wrong. Artificial. I stepped back from the window, my heel catching on a loose floorboard. The sound echoed in the small space like a gunshot, but the figures didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the noise in any way. My skin prickled with goose flesh despite the stuffy heat of the enclosed space. Sweat beaded on my forehead and upper lip, cold despite the temperature. My mouth had gone dry, tongue sticking to the roof as I tried to swallow. Logic offered explanations. Mannequins placed as a prank, reflections in the dirty glass, a family of visitors Uncle Wilbur hadn't mentioned. But logic crumbled as I circled the tower, checking each window, only to find them visible from every angle, still motionless, still staring at the empty road. I forced myself to look away to examine the room instead. The space was largely empty except for an ancient wooden chair in the center and a small table against one wall. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded. With trembling fingers, I opened it, finding yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting. The ink had faded in places, but I could make out dates, entries spanning from 1897 to 1919. Each entry was brief, clinical, almost noting times, weather conditions, and observations of the road. The final entry, dated October 17, 1919, simply read, "They're waiting still. She comes tonight. May God have mercy." My pulse throbbed in my ears as I closed the book. The room seemed to contract around me, the air growing thinner. I returned to the window, compelled by a force I couldn't name. The family remained, but the quality of the air around them had changed. It seemed to shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. As darkness crept across the land, they became more defined rather than less, glowing with a faint phosphorescence that made my stomach churn. I needed to leave to return to the safety of the main house. My muscles tensed, ready to flee, but my attention caught on something new, movement on the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but then I saw her clearly, a woman in white. Her dress billowed around her as if suspended in water rather than air. She didn't walk so much as drift, her feet occasionally seeming to lift entirely from the ground. Her face was obscured by long dark hair that hung like a curtain, but her posture conveyed purpose. She was approaching the waiting family. My mouth went cotton dry as my heart slammed against my rib cage. My fingers clutched the windowsill, nails digging into the soft, rotted wood. I wanted to run, to clatter down those creaking stairs and never look back, but my legs had turned to lead. All I could do was watch, transfixed, as the scene unfolded. The woman stopped about 10 feet from the seated family. For endless moments, they regarded each other in silence. Then, slowly, she raised her arms. The gesture wasn't threatening but supplicating, imploring. The seated figures remained unmoved, their rigid postures suggesting refusal. The woman's shoulders slumped, and even from this distance, I could sense her despair. What happened next defied explanation. The woman's form began to change. Her white dress rippled violently, as if caught in a gale, though not a breath of wind disturbed the prairie grass. Her hair whipped upward, revealing her face for a split second. A face so gaunt and hollow-eyed that my heart seemed to stutter in my chest. Then she was airborne, levitating several feet above the ground, her dress and hair flowing outward in all directions like a terrible white sun. A sound reached my ears then, not from outside, but seemingly from within the tower itself. A low, keening wail that vibrated through the floorboards and resonated in my bones. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was grief made audible, desolation given voice. My hands flew to my ears, but the sound penetrated flesh and bone, reaching directly into my mind. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face, and ice seemed to form in my veins. The journal on the table began to flip its pages rapidly, as if caught in a violent draft. The lone chair spun slowly, deliberately, in the center of the room. And all the while, that terrible wailing continued, rising in pitch until it bordered on a scream. My body finally responded to my brain's desperate commands to flee. I stumbled toward the stairs, my coordination shot by terror, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. As I reached the doorway, a sudden silence fell, so absolute that the absence of sound seemed to press against my eardrums. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I looked back. The ghost woman now hovered directly outside the tower window, her face level with mine, separated only by the dirty glass. Her features were more skull than flesh. Her eyes, deep hollows that somehow still held awareness and recognition. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. She pressed one withered hand against the glass, leaving no condensation, no physical trace. But where her fingers touched, the decades of grime cleared, creating 5 perfect streaks of transparency. Through these cleared lines, I could see the seated family more clearly. They had turned, no longer facing the road but looking directly at the tower, at me. Their faces held the same emaciated quality as the floating woman's skin, stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken into dark recesses. But while her expression held desperation, theirs conveyed only cold judgment. Uncle Wilbur had never told me about Aunt Martha's family. He never explained why we seldom visited. But in that moment, as 4 pairs of hollow eyes stared back at me, I understood. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. My skin prickled with goose flesh despite the stuffy heat of the enclosed space. Sweat beaded on my forehead and upper lip. Cold despite the temperature, my mouth had gone dry, tongue sticking to the roof as I tried to swallow. Logic offered explanations. Mannequins placed as a prank, reflections in the dirty glass, a family of visitors Uncle Wilbur hadn't mentioned. But logic crumbled as I circled the tower, checking each window only to find them visible from every angle. Still motionless, still staring at the empty road. I forced myself to look away to examine the room instead. The space was largely empty except for an ancient wooden chair in the center and a small table against one wall. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded. With trembling fingers, I opened it, finding yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting. The ink had faded in places, but I could make out dates and entries spanning from 1897 to 1919. Each entry was brief, clinical, almost noting times, weather conditions, and observations of the road. The final entry, dated October 17, 1919, simply read, "They're waiting still. She comes tonight. May God have mercy." My pulse throbbed in my ears as I closed the book. The room seemed to contract around me, the air growing thinner. I returned to the window, compelled by a force I couldn't name. The family remained, but the quality of the air around them had changed. It seemed to shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. As darkness crept across the land, they became more defined rather than less, glowing with a faint phosphorescence that made my stomach churn. I needed to leave to return to the safety of the main house. My muscles tensed, ready to flee. But my attention caught on something new, movement on the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but then I saw her clearly, a woman in white, her dress billowing around her as if suspended in water rather than air. She didn't walk so much as drift. Her feet occasionally seemed to lift entirely from the ground. Her face was obscured by long dark hair that hung like a curtain, but her posture conveyed purpose. She was approaching the waiting family. My mouth went cotton dry as my heart slammed against my rib cage. My fingers clutched the windowsill, nails digging into the soft rotted wood. I wanted to run, to clatter down those creaking stairs and never look back, but my legs had turned to lead. All I could do was watch, transfixed as the scene unfolded. The woman stopped about 10 feet from the seated family. For endless moments they regarded each other in silence. Then slowly, she raised her arms. The gesture wasn't threatening but supplicating, imploring. The seated figures remained unmoved, their rigid postures suggesting refusal. The woman's shoulders slumped, and even from this distance I could sense her despair. What happened next defied explanation. The woman's form began to change. Her white dress rippled violently as if caught in a gale, though not a breath of wind disturbed the prairie grass. Her hair whipped upward, revealing her face for a split second. A face so gaunt and hollow-eyed that my heart seemed to stutter in my chest. Then she was airborne, levitating several feet above the ground, her dress and hair flowing outward in all directions like a terrible white sun. A sound reached my ears then. Not from outside, but seemingly from within the tower itself. A low, keening wail that vibrated through the floorboards and resonated in my bones. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was grief made audible, desolation given voice. My hands flew to my ears, but the sound penetrated flesh and bone, reaching directly into my mind. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face and ice seemed to form in my veins. The journal on the table began to flip its pages rapidly as if caught in a violent draft. The lone chair spun slowly, deliberately, in the center of the room. And all the while that terrible wailing continued, rising in pitch until it bordered on a scream. My body finally responded to my brain's desperate commands to flee. I stumbled toward the stairs, my coordination shot by terror, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. As I reached the doorway, a sudden silence fell, so absolute that the absence of sound seemed to press against my eardrums. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I looked back. The ghost woman now hovered directly outside the tower window, her face level with mine, separated only by the dirty glass. Her features were more skull than flesh, her eyes deep hollows that somehow still held awareness and recognition. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. She pressed one withered hand against the glass, leaving no condensation, no physical trace, but where her fingers touched, the decades of grime cleared, creating 5 perfect streaks of transparency. Through these cleared lines, I could see the seated family more clearly. They had turned, no longer facing the road but looking directly at the tower, at me. Their faces held the same emaciated quality as the floating woman's, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken into dark recesses. But while her expression held desperation, theirs conveyed only cold judgment. Uncle Wilbur had never told me about Aunt Martha's family, never explained why we seldom visited. But in that moment, as 4 pairs of hollow eyes fixed on me from across the darkening field, I understood with sickening clarity that I was looking at relatives I would never meet in life. My paralysis broke. I plunged down the stairs, missing steps, banging elbows and knees against the railings, barely registering the pain. Halfway down, a hand clutched my ankle, icy cold, impossibly strong. I didn't look back, just kicked wildly and felt my foot connect with something that gave way with a sound like dry leaves crushed underfoot. The grip released and I practically fell the rest of the way down. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me as I sprinted toward the main house, my lungs burning, a metallic taste flooding my mouth. Behind me, the wailing resumed, now accompanied by other voices, a chorus of inhuman sounds that pursued me across the darkened yard. I burst through the back door, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. Uncle Wilbur sat at the kitchen table, a glass of amber liquid before him, his expression unsurprised. He didn't ask why I was shaking, why sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, or why my eyes were wild with terror. He simply nodded toward the chair opposite him as if he'd been expecting me. He didn't need me to explain what I'd seen. Instead, he spoke of a family feud that had divided the property a century ago, of his wife's ancestors who had died waiting for reconciliation that never came, of Martha's great-aunt Eleanor, who had tried to bridge the divide and was turned away again and again until grief and rejection drove her to end her suffering at the foot of the tower, of bodies buried on opposite sides of the property line, separated in death as they had been in life. Uncle Wilbur believed the cycle could be broken, that someone of both bloodlines might witness their vigil and understand. That's why he had invited me this summer, because my mother had married into the family that owned the eastern half of the original property, because I carried both bloodlines in my veins. The next morning I insisted we leave. I couldn't stay another night knowing what waited in the fields after sunset. Uncle Wilbur didn't argue, but as we packed the car, he pressed the tower key into my palm. Closing my fingers around it, the metal felt unnaturally cold despite the summer heat. He told me I would return someday when I was ready, that the waiting family knew me now, that Eleanor would find me wherever I went. That was 3 years ago. I've moved 4 times since then, changing cities, changing states. But some nights I wake to the sound of a woman wailing outside my window. Some mornings I find 5 clean streaks on dusty glass. And always I feel them waiting. My spectral relatives seated in judgment, their hollow eyes fixed on my future. The key to the tower sits in my bedside drawer. I know with a certainty that chills my blood that it would fit any lock when the time comes for me to return. Sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if I haven't been in the tower all along. If I ever actually left. If all that followed was just the desperate fantasy of a mind that couldn't accept what waited outside those grimy windows. Because no matter how far I run, the waiting family draws nearer. And Eleanor, with her billowing white dress and reaching hands, calls to the blood we share. Uncle Wilbur was right. I will return to the tower. The only question is whether I'll go willingly or be drawn back by forces that transcend my understanding. Either way, when sunset bleeds across the Texas prairie again, I'll take my place in this generation's old vigil. And perhaps at last, I'll learn what they've been waiting for all this time. At 2 hours 24 minutes and 15 seconds, that dominated the space, and arranged on a shelf opposite the bed sat 5 antique dolls, their Victorian-era dresses meticulously preserved, their blank expressions frozen in eternal smiles. When I asked the proprietor, her face hardened. She informed me curtly that the dolls were part of the room's historical authenticity and couldn't be moved. Each had belonged to a young woman who had once lived in this house, she explained, and they remained as a tribute to those who had come before. I unpacked my overnight bag while trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. The doll's glass eyes reflected the dim light from the bedside lamp, creating tiny pinpricks of illumination in their otherwise lifeless faces. I positioned myself so my back was to them as I worked on my laptop, attempting to focus on the research paper I needed to complete by the end of the week. The rain intensified as night fell, lashing against the windows with growing ferocity. The old mansion's electricity flickered once, twice before stabilizing. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, and I decided to turn in early. Sleep, however, proved elusive. The unfamiliar bed creaked with every movement, and the wind howled through some unseen crack in the window frame, creating a high-pitched whistle that set my teeth on edge. Just as exhaustion began to pull me under, a sound different from the storm's fury penetrated my consciousness. A whisper so faint I nearly missed it beneath the rain's steady drumbeat. It said, "It would be my heart's desire." My eyes snapped open, pulse instantly accelerating. The room was dark save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the shelf where the dolls sat, still and silent as before. I strained my ears but heard nothing more than the storm. Convincing myself it had been a trick of my tired mind or the wind's mournful cry, I rolled over and eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. Morning brought weak sunlight and a false sense of security. I laughed at my midnight anxiety while showering in the shared bathroom down the hall. The proprietor served a hearty breakfast in the dining room, informing me I was the only guest that day. When I mentioned having trouble sleeping due to the storm, she nodded sympathetically but said nothing about the dolls or the strange whisper I'd heard. I decided against bringing it up, not wanting to sound like a grown man frightened by children's toys. With my car still dead and the mechanic unable to come until the following day, I resigned myself to another night at the bed and breakfast. I spent most of the day in town, having walked the 3 miles rather than remain in that house with its watchful porcelain inhabitants. The local library provided a welcome distraction, and I researched the history of the area, discovering that the mansion had once belonged to a wealthy industrialist in the late 1800s. Several tragedies had befallen the family over the years, including mysterious illnesses and disappearances, though the accounts were vague and possibly exaggerated for dramatic effect. Returning to the bed and breakfast as dusk approached, I felt a growing reluctance with each step. The sensation intensified when I entered my room to find something had changed. The dolls appeared to be in the same positions, yet something felt different. I stared at them, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me when I realized the middle doll, the one in the blue dress with blonde ringlets, was now facing slightly more in my direction than I remembered. My heartbeat quickened as I approached the shelf. I hadn't touched them, and the proprietor had mentioned that she never entered guests' rooms during their stay. I examined the doll closely, noticing now that its porcelain hands, folded demurely in its lap, had tiny perfect fingernails painted a faded pink. One hand seemed to be clutching something, a miniature locket that I hadn't noticed before. The rational part of my brain suggested that I simply hadn't observed these details previously, yet a growing sense of disquiet persisted. As I prepared for bed, my back deliberately turned toward the shelf while I changed into sleep clothes. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably despite the summer warmth outside, and I pulled the quilt up to my chin as I lay down, fighting the childish urge to hide completely beneath the covers. Sleep came reluctantly, disturbed by creaking floorboards and the distant chiming of a clock I hadn't noticed during the day. I drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake several times to stare into the darkness, convinced I'd heard movement. During one such moment, lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white light, and in that instant, I could have sworn the middle doll was no longer on the shelf. My throat constricted, pulse hammering against my ribs as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. The switch clicked, but no light came. Power outage. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I reached for my phone, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen's glow revealed the time, 3:14 a.m., and cast just enough light for me to see the shelf. The middle doll was missing. A sound escaped me, part gasp, part whimper. As I swept the phone's light around the room, rational explanations flooded in. I was mistaken about the number of dolls. It had fallen behind the shelf. The proprietor had removed it. Yet none of these thoughts could calm the primal fear now surging through my veins. Something scraped against the wooden floor. A sound like tiny feet dragging across the boards came from beneath the bed. My muscles froze, lungs barely drawing breath as I strained to listen. Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then another scrape followed, accompanied by what sounded horribly like the rustle of stiff fabric. It would be my heart's desire. The whisper came from directly beneath me. Childlike yet ancient, innocent yet somehow hungry. My body reacted before my mind could process, leaping from the bed and stumbling across the room. I fumbled desperately with the doorknob, which seemed to resist my frantic attempts to turn it. When the door finally gave way, I practically fell into the hallway, gasping for breath. The house was pitch black. The storm had knocked out all power. Using my phone's light, I made my way downstairs, intending to wake the proprietress to demand explanations and insist on leaving despite the hour and weather. I found her in the kitchen, calmly drinking tea by candlelight, as if she'd been expecting me. When I frantically described what had happened, words tumbling over each other in my haste, she listened with an expression that shifted from concern to something unsettlingly like satisfaction. She suggested I might have been dreaming, that old houses played tricks on the mind, and perhaps I'd care for some tea to calm my nerves. I refused, insisting on checking the room together. She sighed, picking up her candle, and followed me upstairs. Her movements were unhurried, almost reluctant. When we entered the room, the shelf held 5 dolls exactly as before. The middle one sat primly in her place, blue dress arranged perfectly, blonde ringlets framing her porcelain face. The proprietress gave me a pointed look, suggesting my imagination had gotten the better of me. But as she turned to leave, the candlelight flickered across the doll's face, and I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. A smudge of dirt on her previously immaculate cheek. Clutched in her tiny hand, barely visible in the dim light, was a thread that matched the pattern of my pillowcase. I spent the rest of the night in the sitting room downstairs, unable to face returning to that room, to those eyes that now seemed more alive than dead. The proprietress left me alone after providing a blanket, her expression unreadable as she disappeared back to her quarters. I didn't sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house, my mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the mechanic arrived earlier than expected and declared my car easily fixed, a loose connection in the battery, I nearly wept with relief. The proprietress was unsurprised by my hasty departure, accepting my payment with a knowing smile that made my skin crawl. As I threw my bag into the trunk, ready to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place, she approached holding something wrapped in tissue paper. She pressed it into my hand despite my protests, insisting it was a customary parting gift for guests. Her fingers felt cold and brittle against mine, like porcelain rather than flesh. Only when I was miles away, the mansion no longer visible in my rearview mirror, did I unwrap the package. Inside was a tiny locket, identical to the one the doll had been holding. With trembling fingers, I opened it, finding a lock of blonde hair tied with blue thread and a scrap of paper with words written in faded ink. It would be my heart's desire to keep you forever. I threw it out the window, pressing the accelerator to the floor, trying to outrun the memory of glassy eyes that seemed too aware, whispers in the darkness, and tiny footsteps across an ancient floor. But even now, months later, in my apartment hundreds of miles away, I sometimes wake in the night, heart pounding, convinced I've heard a familiar voice whispering those words. And on those nights, I swear I catch a glimpse of something small moving in the shadows. Something with blonde ringlets and a blue dress. Something whose desire seems far from fulfilled.